Hi everyone, welcome to this week's module where we are going to be talking about Chapter 12, which is reporting research results. Now, to clear up some confusion, just so everybody is on the same page, you aren't actually conducting research. So what we're doing is creating a research proposal during this class time. So you're essentially presenting research findings, information that you found related to whatever you're interested in researching, and you're presenting it, and I'm using air quotes, presenting, to someone else, like an internal review board, aka me, to get permission to actually conduct this plan that you've created. So think about it at work. If you were creating a new program or service or product, you wouldn't just say to your boss or investors, here's an idea. You would create a plan, you'd create the design of the project or service, you'd say, here's how it works, here's an image, here's a plan, here's the costs. Would you guys approve doing this research? You create the plan to then go forward, get a permission to actually conduct whatever you're doing, which, I mean, in that example I just used, it's actually bringing the product to development and marketing. So I just wanted to clear that up, that you're just creating this plan, you're not actually working on it. So hopefully that gets us in the right mindset. So for this week, we're talking about reporting our research results. So typically, this is the results of the research that we found if we conducted our research, which again, we're not. So there's two different types of reports. One is a report for business use, and the other is for academic use. And we're typically looking at academic use for this class. So when you're writing a report for business purposes, meaning that you work, say, at Apple or Microsoft or Google, any of those services, companies, you're going to include something called an executive summary, which is a summary of the entire research that you conducted from start to finish. The information provided in the report needs to have a case or rationale made for them. So whatever you do, you need to state why it's in there, why it's included, and give reasonings for it. So you can kind of see how this will line up with academic use in a little bit, because we're telling the reader, whether it be for academic or business use, why we're doing everything that we're doing. Bullet points in a report for business use are acceptable. It's a nice, easy way to keep things organized, clean, and just like this PowerPoint, you could see how the information is split up. So when you're writing a report for business use, everything's split up and it's easier to read. Whereas in academic use, you're not going to use bullet points frequently or at all. And you're going to include things like charts, data tables, or any visual graphics which can help the reader grasp quickly any statistical data that you're trying to present to them. In other words, you're going to use different designs and figures to help the reader understand your research and what you're presenting to them. When you're writing a report for academic use, though, you need to ensure that you are using the correct terminology. So for research that I did at some point, my title was How Flexible Working Arrangements Could Affect Nonprofit Employees. So the correct terminology that I utilized is called flexible working arrangements, which is a different work schedule or working from home, coming in early, leaving early, whatever fits the needs of the employee. Whereas an incorrect terminology would be working from home or just different work schedule. It's a little more, that's a little less formal, and it's better to use the formal terminology for writing an academic paper, which is what you should be doing. If any research or research articles are pointing to some consistent terminology, you should utilize that term. You're going to avoid descriptions when possible and instead take an analytical look at the data. So instead of just describing something, you're going to, in other words, reiterate through an analytical approach. So you're not using your opinions or feelings, you're strictly being objective with the information and research that you have. You need to ensure you're not plagiarizing someone else and ensure you are properly citing the information. So this is something that I actually saw in the literature review. Not a lot of people, or rather, I should say I saw some mistakes related to what could be considered plagiarism. Now, I didn't mark anybody as plagiarizing. However, I did need to point out that if you don't include in-text citations for research, it could be considered plagiarism. You're presenting someone else's information, and if you don't use a citation, the reader believes that it is coming from you and not from someone else that actually did the research. So it's always important to use citations, and especially in-text citations. Those are some of the most crucial aspects of not plagiarizing a paper. You're also going to use journals and academic data to help set the set the stage for your research. It should be staged, not safe. So in other words, you're using verified sources of information to help create this platform of which you're going to explain and base your research off of. That's your literature review that we're mentioning now. And don't use strictly bullet points. Like I said earlier, it's somewhat acceptable to use them in very minor circumstances, such as if you were listing off different research questions that you have or plan to research, that's fine. If you're writing a literature review, probably shouldn't use bullet points, as it should be a cohesive, almost like a story you're trying to tell someone with the use of someone else's information, aka using someone else's journal article. So there's some elements of an academic report. So first, you need to ensure you are using a cover page and the table of contents. This is going to help the reader see immediately, what is this paper? What is it about? What's the research about? And then the table of contents, if they want to quickly skim to something. So, and I'm sure many of you probably did when you're looking at your journal articles. You didn't read everything word for word. Nobody does. People skip over, skim through, and go back and forth between sections. And the table of contents is extraordinarily helpful for that, because it could see, all right, this person talked about flexible working arrangements and how they affect employee retention. So I would like to know, where is that in this article, so I can quickly read that section and see if it's a valid article that I should be using. You're going to have a brief description of what you're going to discuss. So this is introducing the reader, or could be an abstract of sorts, as you see there. So this abstract, in other words, this information unfortunately came a little bit later than the assignment, but the abstract is essentially everything that you've done in a nutshell. So let's say that you actually got approval to conduct this research, and you took it to actually interviewing people, analyzing the data, and presenting your results. What your abstract would be you presenting information from your literature review, bits and pieces to give a general overview, what the general consensus was, as well as what information you found. So the abstract should be able to give you a sense of what your entire paper is about and what the information you discovered or uncovered is in that paper. Moving on, the introduction is different than the abstract, because the introduction essentially is a lead-in to the background or the literature review. So the introduction is kind of like a preface or preface to a book that you read. A lot of times you don't just jump into the story. There is a couple pages before chapter 1 of any book that you find that gives you a sense of the world, okay? And it leads you into what's going on. So maybe it's a mythical book, about Norse mythology or something, and it's giving you a sense of what are you going to see within this book without presenting all of the information that you could find within the book, which is the literature review. Now, before we get to there, the background essentially is why you're doing this research and what the benefit of doing this research is and why it's important to you. Finally, in this section, you're going to see the literature review, which you guys did. Overall, they were very well done. There were some issues that I pointed out, but generally speaking, I think they were very interesting to read, very awesome. And the literature review, as you guys know at this point, is a summary of the different pieces of information you find across multiple articles. So I won't go too deep into literature review, but in a nutshell, you're taking someone else's information from their journal article and plopping it into your paper. And that's okay, because it's not stealing information so long as you give a citation to that person. So you're not claiming that people with flexible working arrangements are more likely to stay at their job even with lower pay. You are restating that information. You're saying someone else, let's say Craven, because that's my last name, Craven found that flexible working arrangements are an incentive to stay at some workplace regardless of pay. Then you're going to have your research objectives. So this is showing someone what the information you look to achieve is. So in other words, why are you doing this research? It's showing someone the objectives. Now, I should point out that this whole section that you see, this whole slide here, typically something that you would find and insert into your academic research paper after you've conducted the research. As you can see in the next section, your findings. So this is what findings you have of the research that you conducted. In our case, the findings would be, what were the findings of the literature review? Then you have a discussion and analysis portion of the paper. So your findings present whatever information you collected from interviewing people. The discussion and analysis section shows someone the interpretation that you have on that information that you found, and you're analyzing your results. Next, you draw your conclusions. You state that flexible working arrangements are an excellent way to retain employees based on your discussion and analysis and your findings. And finally, you make recommendations. Now, these recommendations, typically you have to reflect inward to find out what information you think is relevant to redoing this research or for research going forward. So if you think that there were some problems with your research or challenges, you'll make a recommendation for how to overcome those challenges or to consider those challenges. So in my paper that I published, my recommendation was to actually revisit my research because I wrote my paper at a time where the entire world was shut down because of COVID. So everybody was working from home. So, it was new to people. People liked working from home at that time. So I said that it was relevant to revisit this research in a couple years' time when COVID is over and working from home or alternative work arrangements are more widely accepted and utilized without being forced. So that's what recommendations are. So some things to note. So you always need to have a good idea of what you're writing, and it's always a good idea to have someone else review your work. So, errors aren't as critical in a first draft to, say, your boss, because you're just trying to get a general idea. In other words, leading up to the literature review, I didn't really correct you on grammar because you were just using bullet points and presenting some information. Now that you're writing or that you have written the literature review, I needed to grade you based on your grammar, your tenses, how you're wording things, how you're citing things. Was it correct, incorrect? It's always a great idea to, if you have any concerns or you're unsure of something, share it with, say, the writing center and see if they could review it and see their recommendations. Or better yet, you could send it directly to me and ask me, hey, professor, can you please look this over? And if you have errors, it's not a big deal for your grade because I'm not going to fail you on that because it's a rough draft. It's a first draft, and that's acceptable because your final draft hopefully won't have those errors. So talking about bullet points, they've become, like I said, increasingly more accepted in business reports. They're easy to read. They hold people's attention. In an academic research, you should avoid using these as a primary way of showing data because you want it to be a cohesive sentence that you're presenting to someone. Is it acceptable to use at all in an academic report? I did say to you a little bit earlier, yeah, it is. Very sparingly to present very minimal information, such as what your research questions are, what your goals are, what your objectives are, or maybe even what your questionnaire that you're going to utilize is. And you're going to want to avoid using the first person as much as possible. And it's only accepted when you're writing the reflection portion of your paper. So, that would be in your conclusions or your recommendations. That's when you're allowed to say whatever you want, essentially, because it doesn't matter. It has no bearing on the research when you're writing your recommendations. It has bearing on future research, but you could say that I found it challenging to do this. I found it challenging to do that. Another thing to look forward to is verb tenses. Make sure you're always writing in the present tense, no past tense. Now, with that being said, in the literature review, you may say that Craven said this in 2019. That's okay. But if you're presenting your information and data, you need to be writing in the present tense. If you were to conduct research and actually complete the entire process, at some point you then change your tenses to past tense. So instead of saying, I plan to interview people, at some point in the future, before you submit your final report, you're going to say, I did this, or this was done. We utilized this form of questionnaire, something along those lines. When talking about formatting your paragraphs, lengthy sentences can make the data difficult to read. So ensure that you're only sticking to a single idea within one paragraph. It makes things a lot easier to read and understand as a reader. And make sure that that paragraph only focuses on things related to that one idea. And use subheadings to break up different information chunks. So that way, again, benefit of the reader. Helps them see and understand what you're talking about, so that way they can get in their correct frame of mind. And flow, logical arguments flow from one point to another. If you're arguing what the best food is, you're not going to say that it tastes good and argue a point about taste and then talk about presentation and then go back to taste and then go into the health benefits and then go back to taste. What you're going to do is you're going to say it presents really well. Here's my point about how it's healthy for you, and then you're going to talk about, it tastes really good. Here are my 3 bullet points on taste, or my 3 things I'm going to mention about taste. So it needs to flow as if you're reading a story. It would be really strange and difficult to read if you were bouncing around all over the place in a narrative book. And that's why readers and writers really write cohesively, from one story to the next, one idea to the next. And there's always purpose with what they're writing. So at some point, if you ever do research for a business or for an academic purpose, you're going to need to present that information. And you're going to have to give an oral presentation at some point in your life, especially when you're in college. So being able to present this information orally is crucial, because how are you supposed to get the information to a large number of people, especially busy people? So let's go to the business aspect and we talk about your investors. You need to present to all 5,000 investors of your company what information you found related to a product is, instead of just emailing all 5,000 of them a document or a lengthy document, because many of them probably won't read because they may not have the time for that. So you're going to start with your big ideas and work your way down from there. And you're going to speak to the audience and possibly encourage their involvement. It makes them more engaged and much more likely to understand the point that you're making. And it's good practices to ask early on something of the audience which tells you about their experience. So reaching out to the audience. You're going to use visual aids rather than just endless bullet points, because it helps present information a little bit better. So instead of just using bullet points like on this slide, I make things a little bit more interesting, like trying to mix up how the information is presented, such as slides like this. It makes it a little bit more engaging. The bullet points are meant for a summary and not for the entire report. And you should only use quotes when applicable. So your whole presentation shouldn't just be quote after quote. Only use it when you think it's incredibly relevant. And don't use PowerPoint slides as a script for your presentation. It's much better if you're able to elaborate on things. So instead of, take this presentation, for example. I read these bullet points as a general outline. However, I know how to elaborate and explain the different points you see here. Using something like Prezi offers a lot more visual aid opportunities. So now we're going to talk about your project deliverable for this week. So this was a pretty short presentation. So we'll talk about what is expected from this week's assignment. So now that you wrote your literature review and your methodology sections of your paper, the bulk of everything you've done is complete. Now we're going to put the finishing touches on the paper and get ready for submission. So first, we need to start with the cover page. So some of you actually already have a cover page, and that's great. If you don't, you need to insert one. And here's what you're going to insert. So you're going to insert the title of the paper, your name, the author, institutional affiliation, meaning Lackawanna College, the course number and the course name, the instructor name, so that's going to be my name, and the assignment due date. Now, in a real world setting, you don't really need the assignment due date, but for this cover page, we're going to utilize it. So, when we talk about the abstract, is a short description of your research, typically 250 words or less, so nothing crazy. 1 to 2 paragraphs is what we're looking for. The point is to just keep things short and sweet. It's a general summary of everything that you found. So in this case, it would be your literature review. So essentially a brief summary of your literature review of 1 to 2 paragraphs. Make it comprehensive. Don't just say things. Make sure you're actually talking about the different things that you saw and found and learned in your literature review. And please use in-text citations, because again, just like the literature review, you're using someone else's information to present these ideas, which means you need to give reference to those authors. So the summary or the conclusion section is where you're going to summarize everything that you've done so far. So you're going to summarize what your topic is, what your research questions are, what you found in the literature review, what your objectives are, things like that. You're going to summarize it all in this 1 to 2 paragraph section. You're also going to summarize the methodology that you're going to be utilizing. So you're going to summarize the literature review, topic, problems, things like that, but also the methodology of how you're going to interview people and how you're going to go about interviewing people. So maybe you're going to use random sampling or selective sampling or snowball sampling. You need to explain that and why that's important. And this needs to be all in your own words, so you don't need to use quotes from sources, and there is no need for citations of any kind. So in the abstract, in the literature review, in the introduction, you're going to use in-text citations. But this summary is not, it doesn't require you to use citations, because this is just from your voice. And at that point, now you're done. Congratulations, because you completed a research paper, and that's awesome, and you should really give yourself a round of applause. This is not something that's easy to do, and I think you all did an outstanding job regarding this. Before you submit the paper, though, make sure you have the following sections within the paper. So you need your cover page, your abstract, your introduction, your literature review, your methodology, and your summary, and your reference page. All of these need to be on the same document, formatted in APA formatting. So I made some comments about your literature reviews, which you're going to have to correct because you're going to be graded on everything for this week's assignment. So yes, you're producing a couple pieces like the abstract and the summary section, but you're also graded on everything because this is your final proposal. And again, this is my air quotes I'm using, proposal. So please make sure you go and heed to my literature review comments, because if you don't make those corrections, odds are is you're not going to get a very good grade on this. Make sure you use those in-text citations. Make sure your reference page is formatted properly. And you can submit that all as one document, so it should look very professional. I look forward to reading them, and I'm very excited to see what you guys produce, and I hope you have a beautiful day today. Thank you. Bye.